We just completed our second episode of the series called The Next Skill Sets. And we had a terrific session with a half dozen fantastic guests who were talking through the question of what is the skill sets that will be needed in the future that address whole person development.
Because I think a fundamental skill that we should be working on with our students, we should be working on in our institutions, is coming to be able to act within uncertainty. I think education, K-12, but also colleges and universities spend a lot of time sort of putting students in boxes and giving them very limited choice. And so they're very comfortable acting within prescribed boundaries. And it seems like the future is going to be full of opportunities where we don't know everything we need to know.
One of the things one would like to see develop in a person in the course of her education is a growing capacity for judgment, both in the most practical or technical matters and in larger questions of values, of political judgment and the like. Judgment's a very elusive faculty because it's a capacity which would be very hard to measure in anything that one would think of as a test.
The ability to apply what they've learned in the classroom to an out-of-school setting, which requires a particular kind of mediation. So it is about that moral, the judgment, the ability to pick the right problem, mindfulness, what you should be paying attention to, who you should be paying attention to, in an era where that isn't going to be dictated to you up front. You know, the recent Gallup Purdue poll that came out about, they interviewed thousands and thousands of people about how their college experiences related to thriving in life, and they really confirmed that these personal connections with faculty, the ability to engage in real meaningful projects, internships, application of their learning in real life. These are the things that characterized people who are thriving in life.
I think we should start to teach innovation. That innovation is such an important skill, but it isn't really being taught specifically as a discipline. Maybe it's time that we start to do that through experiential learning, through studio-based learning, where students are asked to innovate rather than just absorb facts. There can be a tendency to have humongous reading lists, massive exams, and tons of memorizing, and that's not really preparing people for the real world.
This larger learning system is very much influenced by data and the role that technology will play in starting to shape what kind of work that humans will do that's unique compared to the work that computers will do.
We're on the cusp of a really very different world. The computing technologies will change the game in terms of what skills humans have that are unique and still necessary versus what we get from machines. And machines are much better at processing large amounts of data. With regard to artificial intelligence, I don't anticipate that, in the next decade or two, we're going to have general artificial intelligence that's comparable to a human. But we will have systems that are incredibly good at doing things like diagnostics. So where deduction is important, I think computers are generally better than humans. But where induction is important, humans are better than machines. Students will need to learn how to use computer systems and data sets for deduction. But for induction, they need to learn innovation and data visualization or telling stories with data.
I'm not sure I would use the terms deduction and induction. A colleague of mine, Dick Murnane, an economist in the Harvard Ed School, has written with Frank Levy a book called The New Division of Labor. I think the big thing that they've identified is solving novel problems, where you can't rely on a computerized routine in order to produce a result. In fact, a great example of a novel problem is there's nothing in the computer manual that tells you what to do when the computer isn't working. The other thing I think that computers yet don't have any capacity to do, I kind of hope they don't acquire, is moral judgment, judgments of right and wrong and what's good to do and what's not good to do. That's quintessentially something that I think is important for human beings to be good at and to learn to practice at.
What are the things we can do together that computers can't do, or at least can't do yet? And so I think there's a great opportunity here, instead of approaching this from a place of fear, but to approach it from an opportunity and say there's business we used to have to do to keep society running that we don't anymore.
There's a significant generational disconnect among this learning system in that different generations are engaged in learning in very different ways, using very different media.
That at no time in human history have the different generations used such widely different media to communicate. If you look at how high school students communicate and learn, they're using mobile apps. If you look at people in their 30s through middle age, we're still using the web and email. And if you look at senior citizens, increasingly they've started to come online. The world we're going into, we'll see them come back together, but it'll be a very different environment in terms of the skills you need to be successful.
The involvement of parents and educators and mentors in the young people's space of natural network exploration is absolutely critical to the connection to opportunity.
Universities no longer have a monopoly on learning. They're just a node in this larger learning system. So the real design challenge that we're faced with is, how do you bring these two things together? How do you imagine how you can combine what's unique and powerful about universities with this larger learning system that's evolving and emerging all around us?
Teachers underestimate in many cases both how much work it would be to revise their practice modestly in the direction of more interactive and the other kinds of things we've been talking about. They overestimate how hard it would be, and they underestimate how rewarding it is. It may be that just a little bit of interaction makes a lot of difference, and that once you start experiencing it, it may become a little bit addictive.
We see that even very small changes in practice, like just a faculty member who connected with a student interest, who had a project that was relevant in the real world, to have, a maker space or project-based learning, these things which seem incremental on the part of faculty or educational institutions are life-changing. I want to underscore that, but I can't reduce it just to one. So I want to actually put out a pie in the sky, more systemic change piece that really comes from my work with teenagers. This total arms race of achievement that the admissions criteria for elite and selective schools is destroying their childhood and their ability among a certain sector of society of children to explore, tinker, take risks, be creative.
I want to take everything everybody else has said and also, more fundamentally maybe, create more spaces for students to lead us. What we do in higher education is we teach to them instead of doing things with them. And so that kind of reorientation and saying, the faculty have to be involved and the institution has to change in certain ways. We have to think about admissions, we have to think about purpose and expectation, but we also have to create space for students to make the education their own and make it really meaningful.
A second really important conflict that we started to unpack in the conversation had to do with equity, the costs of higher education and the equity of who has access to this kind of education.
Progressive education has been around for a long time for relatively privileged groups, but the question is really, what role is this technology going to play in either broadening that gap or narrowing it? The problem is that empirically we know that the technology is more likely to create greater inequities, so that as is typical, without really principled institutional and public policy, when you give openly available tools and capacities to society, the already privileged take greater advantage of those tools. That old truism of it's not what you know, but who you know starts to apply with a vengeance. And I'll just mention one more thing, which is, again, with higher education, we know that everybody is tending to go into college at higher rates, but of course the more privileged kids are going at even higher rates, so the equity gap is continuing to rise, and it's becoming, if anything, more of an arms race rather than an equalizing function. But the gap is even bigger in out-of-school learning. The growing equity gap between the expenditures and access that privileged families have to enrich learning specialized learning, interest-driven learning. A lot of this differentiation and opportunity is happening in these more informal and privatized kinds of settings. And again, that's where I think our institutions really have to respond to the opportunity gap here.
I was just going to add, Randy, that I think the issues of the values of diversity and equity, clearly liberative agency, can be woven through all of the fundamental core purposes of higher education. But I was going to add something that might lead to another step in this general conversation. For many people, there's a real dismay with any valuing of higher education. They don't see higher education as particularly valuable. And either or not, we would be going down the right path if we were trying to encourage the greater valuing of higher education, if we took the line that we could offer it at less cost, or if we took the line that we can do it efficiently with technology, or if we took the line that higher education, and we'd value it because it's uniquely poised to address the most fundamental and pressing questions that we face. Higher education is uniquely poised to address those, and perhaps not only uniquely poised, but perhaps singularly in the sense of there are no other organizations or structures on the horizon that could do so.